Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting these pastel autumn leaves. They're a little bit different because I want to approach this in a more illustrative way and I'm going to use light pastel colors this time. Usually when I paint autumn leaves, they're quite detailed, but this time I want things to look a bit more simplified, so I'm not going to worry too much about creating textured edges and things like that. And at this point, I just want to put down the ideas of the types of leaves that I want to include in this painting. I'm not going to take my time at this point because I just want to get things down, and I'm going to erase and move things around as I go. To make the composition look a bit more interesting, I like to include fern leaves as well, like the one that I'm drawing right now, and pair it with some simple leaf shapes as well. I'm starting with some leaves or groups of leaves which are fairly large and will take a fair amount of space. This way I can fill in the smaller areas with smaller leaves later on. I'm going to try to include as many varieties as I can think of, and you can do this by playing with the length of the leaves, the closeness on how they grow or branch out, if the leaves are in groups, or if the edges are curved or pointy, and so on. You can also look up references for more inspiration for different leaf types. The takeaway that I can say after painting this whole set though, when I was outlining it with pencil, I feel like the shapes of the leaves look a bit more plump than after I colored it. So if I were to do this again, I think I would make the leaves look more thick and plump next time so they look cuter. I know it's a bit too late for me now, but it's something you can think about for your own composition. So here, after drawing the larger leaves, I tried to fill in the rest of the space with smaller ones, and if some areas doesn't look right, I will erase and redraw some of the leaves to make the spacing a bit more even. As for the rest of the space, which is a bit too small to paint on extra leaves, I'm going to fill it in with some small acorns and horse chestnuts. I'm fairly happy with the variety now, but I just want to even out the spacing, so I'm going to redraw and reposition some of the leaves. This is why I didn't want to spend too much time and energy to draw every single leaf beforehand, because I'm just going to erase and move things around. But this is when I start to think about the shapes more, making sure that the guidelines are something I can follow as I paint. The fern on the right here looks a bit messy, and I know that I'm going to get confused as I paint, so I'm going to redraw the leaves, making the fern look less dense. This way I can see each individual shapes as well. As I get towards the bottom, I'm going to create more curved lines for the leaves, making them longer. But for the very last one at the bottom, I'm going to make it slightly shorter to cinch it back in again. By the way, since I want to color the leaves fairly lightly, I do want to make sure that the lines that I'm drawing is quite light. If your outlines are a bit too dark, you can always use a kneadable eraser to erase the excess, or you can use a regular eraser if it's good enough and just tap on the lines. Next, here are the colors I'm going to use. This is Vermilion by Holbein, Chinese White by Holbein, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Hooker's Green by Cotman, Crimson Lake by Holbein, and Indigo by Schmincke. Now let's get to painting. For the first one, I'm going to use a mix of indigo, Hooker's Green, a little bit of Crimson Lake, and also Chinese White to make the color a bit more pastel. As you can see, there are patches in my palette where I've separated the darker tones and the lighter tones. This way I have easy access to all the different variety of colors. I first use a medium to thin consistency with the pastel tone, and while the surface is still damp, I use the darker blue at the bottom of the leaves. I'm going to do this a few leaves at a time, so the leaves are not completely dry, but they won't be too wet as I'm adding the darker value. For some of the longer leaves, sometimes I like to extend the darker value so it doesn't look too light and faded. And as for the leaves which are very close together or overlapping each other, I like to wait for the overlapping leaves to completely dry before painting on the ones next to them or overlapping them. This way the paint won't just blend with each other, creating a silhouette instead of separate shapes. As for the stem, I'm just going to use the same mix without the Chinese white, and I'm also using a thick consistency with my size 0 brush. For the next leaf, I'm going to use the same color mixture, but I'm going to add more Crimson Lake and Hooker's Green with Chinese white, so the color is a little bit more green than blue compared to the previous one. I'm using a medium consistency to cover the top part of the leaf, and as I get towards the bottom, I pick up some of the more bluish tone from earlier. This way there's a subtle change of color. Then while the surface is still damp, I also dot in a thicker consistency of the same mix, and just letting it spread to create a textured surface. Again, for the next one, I'm going to use the previous color mixture. This time I added some titanium gold ochre to create more of the sage green. Then I'm going to use a thick consistency and dot it in at the bottom while the surface is still damp. For the next one, I'm working from the previous mixture and added some Crimson Lake, so the color is a little bit more brown. I'm using a medium to thin consistency to cover the base, then following this up with a slightly thicker consistency and dotted in the damp surface for the texture. As you can see, I like to work from the previous colors that I've already pre-mixed or just have on my palette. So for this next one, I'm using Crimson Lake with Titanium Gold Ochre, and I'm going to paint these leaves the same way by starting with a medium to thin consistency to paint the base, then following it up with a slightly thicker consistency at the bottom while the surface is still damp. As you can see, I already have a variety of colors on my palette pre-mixed, and I can just keep adding on more pigment to play around with the color variation ever so slightly. You can even play around with the ratio to create a slightly different tone. So as an example, I added more titanium gold ochre in this mixture, so the leaves are more orange compared to the previous group of leaves, which were a bit more red. For the small maple leaf at the top, I'm going to use the same orange mixture from before, but I'm going to only paint the tip. Then while the surface is still damp, I'm going to follow this up using the light green that I've already pre-mixed to paint the bottom, and I'm just going to connect all the leaves together. For this next one, I'm using a mix of Hooker's Green with Crimson Lake, and because the Hooker's Green is a fairly cool green tone, it has a lot of blue, so mixed with the Crimson Lake, it will create this really nice, slightly muted purple. I also added some Chinese white to turn this into a pastel tone. Then I'm going to add more Crimson Lake into the mixture for the darker value near the center or the stem. For the fern, I want to use an orangey brown color, so I'm using the previous mixture with some orange that I've already had on my palette. Just like I mentioned earlier, I don't like mixing all the colors together on my palette. I leave spaces where I have access to the different tones, so as you can see here, some of the leaves are a bit more orange. For this one, I added Crimson Lake into the previous orangey mixture. With the limited palette that I have, I'm able to create all these different tones, and hopefully after painting these leaves, you'll get the idea of how I play with colors and you can create your own variations. You can also use single colors without mixing with others, but by using a limited palette, we can basically make all the colors consistent together even though there are so many different hues. After all these leaves are completely dry, I felt like it looks quite flat since the colors have faded, and I need to add some darker values to bring more interest to the composition. So here I decided to go over some of the leaves using a thicker consistency of the similar color to the base, and I'm only going to paint some of the leaves as accents. After adding on the darker values to some of the larger leaves, I'm going to paint on the stem. I switched to my size 0 brush for this, and I'm using a thick consistency of the color similar to the base. So if the leaf is more orangey, I try to use a reddish orange color for the stem, and if the leaves are mostly green, I try to use a dark green, and so on. As for the details like the midribs and the veins, I'm just going to use this same brush and pick up a color that will match the color of the leaves. It doesn't have to be the exact same color, and you can play around with this. You can also use a pen to do this if it's a little bit difficult to control your small brush, or you can also use colored pencils. This was actually my original idea, which is to use colored pencils, but I couldn't find them when I was painting this, so I just used my watercolors instead. However, if you have access to colored pencils, I would highly recommend it because I feel like the texture of the colored pencils would really enhance this painting. But anyway, I just accepted my fate and just painted the details using my brush. It is a bit more tedious, but it's still doable. As for the color, I like to play around with the consistency as well. So if I don't want certain details like the veins here to look too dark against the base, I like to use a lighter consistency, and for the midribs, I like using a slightly thicker consistency. And I'm just going to continue to paint the details for the rest of the leaves. Next, I'm going to paint the horse chestnuts. For this, I used a mix of Focus Green and a lot of titanium gold ochre. I started by painting a circle and filling it in. Then with a light load on my brush, I painted some lines on the outer portion. You can also use your small brush to paint on those tiny lines. For the stem, I just picked up a reddish brown that I've already pre-mixed, and I just paint it on while the surface is still damp and just let the color run into each other. As for the acorns, I use a light consistency of titanium gold ochre for the bottom part, and for the hat and the stem I use the same reddish brown. To add a little bit of form, I use a darker version of the titanium gold ochre by mixing it with a little bit of the brown and paint a line at the bottom to make it look more three-dimensional, and I also added dots using the same green for the horse chestnuts. At first I didn't know if I wanted to paint the veins for these leaves or not, but since they're fairly large, I'm going to paint them on. And after this, I'm also going to add some lines to the acorns following the roundness, and this will again enhance the form. After this, I'm pretty much done, but I felt like painting more tiny leaves. I just felt like it'll do good for the composition as little accents, and I'm also going to use a really thick consistency of whatever color I pick, so these leaves can still pop out as little details. I'm just going to add 3 small leaves, and that's basically it for this painting. I really love the color combination of this one, but I just wish some of the leaves look a little bit fuller and larger so the composition can look more colorful that way. But yeah, like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. I will also link the outline in my coffee shop. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!